Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where today we are going to continue and actually wrap up our consideration of the chapters in Leviticus that have to do with instructions related to purity. We see those in Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. We've kind of gone out of order with those chapters. We've looked at chapter 11 already with a couple lessons. Took 2 lessons to cover the dietary laws. And then we looked at chapters 12 and 15 during the last lesson that had to do with childbirth and the laws relating to discharges, male and female discharges. And now today we're going to look at chapters 13 and 14 that have to do with a number of different things related to diseases and molds that barred people from the sanctuary. And so remember, that's kind of what we're dealing with here, this idea of access being denied, trying to make sense of Leviticus chapters 12 through 15. We talked about this in the last lesson, but God's presence demands purity or cleanliness and holiness, sanctification. And blemishes, both physical and spiritual blemishes, excluded people from the presence of the Lord at the tabernacle. And access was denied if certain conditions existed. But of course, this access wasn't necessarily denied permanently because cleansing rituals were provided by God in His grace. And so some of those conditions that are outlined in Leviticus chapters 12 through 15 have to do with childbirth, as I mentioned, skin diseases and mold, which we're going to look at today, and also bodily discharges, which we looked at last week as well. And so let's go ahead and move forward in looking at skin diseases and contamination from Leviticus chapters 13 and 14. One of the things we see in these chapters is that the priest in Israel functioned as a health inspector and a judge of the people, as well as a mediator and an intercessor for the people. So he was to inspect some of these conditions that would bar people from the sanctuary precincts. It was also to examine not only people, but houses as well that carried potential diseases. And so one of the things we see the priests doing in these chapters is determining cleanliness or uncleanliness through this process, this inspection of examination, washing, isolation, and then reevaluation. That's kind of the process the priest is instructed to go through to identify these diseases that would bar people from entering into the tabernacle until they were cleansed. A couple things to note here. There was an importance of caring for the physical health of individuals and the community in this whole process. But as we talked about last week, the concern of these chapters continues to be on the purity of God's dwelling, keeping the dwelling house of the Lord pure, clean, holy. Another thing that's important to note is that the priest's actions in these chapters 13 and 14 are not curative. They do not give any kind of medicine. There's no kind of healing ritual involved. There's no kind of physician activity involved on the part of the priests. Only purification rituals for the already cured. Priests are pronouncing the condition of the people, whether they're clean or they're unclean. They are not effecting that condition. Only God could cure someone who had been unclean with these skin diseases. And so that's important to note as we move forward. Moving forward then, there are a number of things dealt with in these chapters, and they break down this way. In chapter 13, verses 1 through 46, we're dealing with the identification of various skin diseases. A lot of translations historically have simply translated the word leprosy, but more modern translators and other research has led people to think more broadly about skin diseases in general and not just leprosy. Leprosy would have been included, but it's broader than that. Identifying various skin diseases that were afflicting people. And then the remaining verses of that chapter, just 13 verses there at the end of chapter 13, identifying molds and mildews in garments is taken up. And then we pick up with the restoration of skin diseases, which we're going to spend most of our time on today. Restoration of skin diseases, chapter 14, verses 1 through 32. And then how to deal with molds and mildews that were in the dwelling places of the people, verses 33 through 57 of chapter 14 there. And so when we look at the various skin diseases, they're outlined in chapter 13. You can read those. But when we get to chapter 14, we get to this ritualistic cleansing of those who had been cured of those skin diseases. And remember, it's not the priest who cures them. The priest simply pronounces them cured by divine grace. But in terms of the ritual involved in the restoration of those suffering from skin diseases, there was a ritual outside the sanctuary, and then there was a ritual at the entrance to the tent of meeting, at the entrance to the sanctuary. So the ritual outside the sanctuary included two birds. One bird was to be killed, and the affected person was to be sprinkled 7 times with that bird's blood. Now, many people see in this that served as a reminder of the fate of the worshiper apart from God's healing mercies, that it would have been his blood spilled. Now, maybe not literally, but his condition spoke of death. We've talked about that before, that uncleanness had this aura of death about it, and the leper was someone who was outside the camp, removed from the presence of God. And remember, to be in the presence of God who gives life was to find life. To be removed from his presence is to encounter death. And so this leper or person suffering from skin diseases, who is barred from not just the sanctuary precincts, but from the camp as a whole. They had to live outside the camp in isolation. Remember, we talked about new mothers last week and how that can sometimes be offensive for people to read. New mothers were not removed from living in the camp. They were removed from entering into the tabernacle precincts during the time of their purification until they were cleansed, but they weren't barred from the entire Israelite camp. People with skin diseases were. And so to be cut off from the people of God and to be cut off from the tabernacle was to be removed from the source of life in the Lord. And so this reminds the worshiper of his or her fate, this blood being sprinkled. But it's also this atoning blood that is restorative by grace. Sacrifice is required for this cleansing. Now the other bird wasn't sacrificed. The other bird was released into the air, which many take to be symbolic of the freedom from and removal of the condition, the previous condition that afflicted the person, which has now been cured. After this, the person was to shave completely, the entire body, kind of an indicator of exposure and transparency. They're not hiding anything. Anything on the skin, any lesion, any possible disease could be detected. It was exposed. And so they waited then after 7 days after shaving, but they could enter the camp. And then they had to wait 7 days before this second part of the ritual happens. But note that no confession of sin is required here by the person who had been healed of this skin disease. This is really, really important, again, for these categories, not to confuse clean and unclean with sinless and sinful. That's a confusion of categories. It's not exactly what we're dealing with here. And of course, again, you can go back to some previous lessons where we talked about this, that sin does render someone unclean, but there are other things that rendered people ritually unclean in the scriptures as well. So it's very important for us to wrap our minds around that when we're reading the book of Leviticus. No confession of sin is required here on the part of the person who had been healed, only cleansing. Just to note, as we finish up these chapters and start moving into Leviticus chapter 16, in the next lesson, Lord willing, that has to do with the Day of Atonement, note the similarities between the 2 birds and the 2 goats that we'll see on the Day of Atonement, one who is sacrificed, one who goes free. But significantly here, there's no laying on of hands or confession of sin in Leviticus chapter 14. We do have that in Leviticus chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement, a laying on of hands, confessing of sin over the goat. We don't have that here. No confession of sin. This is not dealing with moral violations. Ritual uncleanness is what's being dealt with here. The ritual at the sanctuary entrance then is the second part of this. This happens on the 8th day, beginning of a new week, the beginning of a new creation in a way. We can understand that part of what's happening here for this person who had been healed from this skin disease, again, not by a priest, but by divine grace, is being brought back into the presence of life. There's a rebirth that's happening, a new creation, a new week, new birth happening here. And by the way, that connects to New Testament kinds of themes as well, because our new life is inaugurated on the 8th day, which is a Sunday, with the resurrection of the Lord. Hope that makes sense. I think we've talked about that before. The first day of a new week is the 8th day, and that's Sunday, the day of resurrection. Which, by the way, just as a side note, every Sunday that we worship on the Lord's Day as God's people is a celebration of the resurrection. We're gathering together not according to the old covenant marking of time on the seventh day as the Sabbath, but we're gathering on the first day of the week in celebration of resurrection. And so every Sunday is Easter. I think we lose sight of that, unfortunately, quite regularly, but we're celebrating and really expressing the new life we have in Christ Jesus every time we gather to worship on the first day of the week, because we're a reborn people. But anyway, aside from that, this is happening on the eighth day, this kind of rebirth, but sacrifices are required in order for this person to enter into this reborn state. And that's true of us as well. Sacrifices were required for us to enjoy new birth and deliverance from our sins. There's a guilt offering, and this was perhaps for time that this individual would have missed in participating in the worship of the people. And so there is a guilt offering that's to be offered, the 1/5 reparation. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, it's because you missed the earlier lessons where we talked about the sacrifices outlined in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. We talk about the guilt offering there. You can go back and check that out. But that 1/5 reparation is not required here. Just the guilt offering itself. There is a purification offering to be offered, a burnt offering, and a grain offering. So 4 out of those 5 offerings that we read about in the early chapters of Leviticus are here to be offered by the one being healed and cleansed from skin diseases. So all these are required for atonement and full restoration. But there is full restoration enjoyed here. They're welcomed back into the community as full participants who are consecrated for service. And the reason that I'm emphasizing that point is one of the things we see in the 14th chapter of Leviticus is the application of blood from the guilt offering to the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right big toe. Where have we seen that before? Well, we've actually seen that before in the consecration of the priests to their service unto God. Now, this person who is being healed from a skin disease is not being consecrated as a priest, but they are being consecrated for service unto the Lord. They're restored to full status, full service unto the Lord, and being able to draw near to him in his presence as he dwells in the tabernacle. And so a wonderful sign of grace that we see here applied to this individual who had been isolated and removed from the community and the source of life in God for an indeterminate amount of time. So that's the process of restoring those who had been cleansed from skin diseases. We also read about houses having to be cleansed from mold or mildews that are detected. Of course, houses anticipated life in the land. And these instructions are anticipating that because at this point, the people are living in tents around the tabernacle. So the people are encamped with the Lord's tent in the middle. Of course, outside that is outside the camp. But for people to be in the camp is to simply be in their tents. For people to go into the sanctuary precincts is to approach the tent of the great king who is dwelling in the middle of them. But when we talk about houses, and by the way, it's easier to take care of issues of contamination in tents. You simply burn them. But you don't want to do that with houses necessarily. And so these instructions here at the end of Leviticus 14 are anticipating when the people dwell in the land and build houses for themselves. And so, again, there's this process of examining, removing, replastering, checking back, reevaluating, and then possibly having to destroy the house if the contamination isn't resolved. And actually, the cleansing of the house also involves the ritual of the birds, but no sacrifices for atonement, since it did not involve people. So if we just go back to this, you have this portion of the cleansing of the houses, but you don't have this portion of the offering of the sacrifice because no people are involved. And part of this could simply be a reflection that God's house was to remain undefiled. That again, the main concern here is not necessarily health or hygiene of the people, although that might be an indirect and secondary benefit of these things. The main concern is the purity of God's dwelling. And if God's dwelling was to remain pure, the people were to have dwellings that remained pure and undefiled as well. And when they became corrupted, they required cleansing rituals. And so what does all this mean? Again, 3 steps to learning to love Leviticus. Context, which we talked about early on in the series. Content, which is what we're dealing with now, but also completion in the person and ministry of Jesus. And so how does all this kind of come together and relate to us? Well, our holiness still encompasses the physical, our bodies and what impacts them. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20. You are not your own. You are bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God with your body. Our bodies are part of what we're given to steward, what we're given to maintain, most of it, because we're not under the Old Testament rituals and regulations. Most of what that entails is remaining separate morally. So it has more to do with a moral purity. But that's not disconnected, though, from kind of physical purity as well. We should steward our bodies well by physical activity. We should be mindful of how we fuel our bodies with food. We should take care of our bodies well. And that's part of our holiness in living for the Lord and stewarding what he has entrusted to us, not just the things around us or the material possessions he's given us, but stewarding our very bodies is an important part of our faithfulness to the Lord. But also important lessons here in these chapters is that they speak of God's grace that reveals a way back for the unclean. Yes, there are pronouncements upon those who find themselves in conditions that render them or that renders access denied to God's presence in the tabernacle, but there's grace for that. That's one of the things that keeps coming up again and again in Leviticus that we need to see. And this is how we learn to love the book, is to not just see all these rules and regulations, but to then see those rules and regulations and realize that there's grace for that. There's rituals that sanctify. There's rituals that purify and make clean. And that should speak to us as people who require sanctification and cleanliness to live in the presence of a holy God. And that's all supplied for us by Jesus. And so these chapters speak of God's grace that reveals a way back for the unclean, but that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus in a number of ways. Jesus, we see, is a better priest. Because one of the things we emphasized here is that the priest only pronounces clean and unclean. The priest does not actually treat the individual. But Jesus is a better priest who not only announces, but effects our cleansing. And we see this in the New Testament. He does that for lepers. He heals lepers in the New Testament. He heals a woman with a flow of blood. We look at that at the end of Leviticus chapter 15, the condition of a woman outside of just the normal menstruation, but has a chronic flow of blood. She's barred access to the presence of God in the tabernacle, and yet Jesus is a better priest who effects cleansing for her. He effects cleansing for unclean Gentiles. And actually, this encompasses all of the pollution and disharmony and contamination that affects the created order. And we see this when Jesus calms the storm. He sets everything back in proper order and brings healing and stability and wholeness. Jesus is someone greater and more gracious than the Old Testament tabernacle or temple. Jesus says, remember, that someone greater than the temple is here. And one of the ways he's greater than the temple is that there's more grace to be offered in Jesus. The tabernacle and the temple could not effect what was required to enjoy God's presence, which was purity and holiness. But Jesus can effect those things. He can bring us cleansing and does bring us cleansing by his blood. Jesus, through his death and resurrection, alters the message of Leviticus, which here is keep out, access denied. But Jesus transforms that message to come near and let me make you clean. And so the message in the gospel is access is restored in Jesus. And of course, we see this access restored here through the rituals of water and blood often. But what do we read about Jesus in the New Testament? That at his crucifixion, one of the Romans stuck a spear in his side, and what came out but water and blood. And so his death brings us cleansing and holiness and sanctification. We draw near to him in faith. He makes us clean and gives us access to the Father and access to life because we have access to the Father. So finally, Jesus, our high priest, has borne our sicknesses and our infirmities, and we are assured of whole bodies, not just redeemed spirits, but whole bodies, resurrected bodies, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, by faith in him. And we're assured of life, overcoming all traces of the curse, including every disease, all physical blemishes, no blindness, no deafness, no lame. Remember in the New Testament, Jesus comes and he heals all of those things because that's the coming kingdom. The coming kingdom tramps out every trace of the curse, physically and spiritually, and brings wholeness and removes all blemishes by his redemptive work in the age to come. And by faith in him, we become participants in that. That's good news of the gospel. I mean, that's what we want to hear, and that's what helps us learn to love Leviticus. Finally, just a couple last notes here. The sphere of application of these chapters is really, really important. It's not the church. So when we think, well, maybe we need to apply these to the church, and menstruating women shouldn't be able to come to worship services, and those with skin diseases or who are contaminated or contagious shouldn't come to church. Well, maybe people who have contagious diseases might need to stay home if they're sick. I mean, I'm recording these lessons in the middle of a global pandemic, COVID-19, and yeah, that's a good thing. If you're sick, stay home. But that's not the application of these chapters. These chapters have to do with nothing unclean entering into the heavenly sanctuary. Revelation chapter 21, verse 27 says this. It says, "But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life." And so it's not that nothing unclean enters the church. It's that nothing unclean ultimately enters into the glorious presence of the Lord in heaven. And when the new heavens come down, new heavens and new earth, we can't survive in his presence without being clean and without being holy. And yet Jesus provides those things for us. And so the application of these chapters is not what do we do in terms of our church buildings and our church facilities. It's how are we made clean and made holy so that we might dwell in the presence of God in his heavenly dwelling, the new heavens and new earth forever and ever, and be acceptable before him. It's by the blood of Jesus and by his cleansing work for us, received by faith. Last thing, our restoration involves body and soul and the whole of creation in the consummated kingdom. Christians share with ancient Israel the view that someday all defilement will be removed from this world, not just us, but from this world by God's final act of redemption and restoration when Jesus comes again. And so there again, the good news of Leviticus is that these things are fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus, and we look to him, and this is how we learn to love Leviticus. And so that brings us about to the halfway point of our study of this book. We are through the instructions for purity, and we will pick up next time, Lord willing, by looking at this very critical chapter, chapter 16, on the Day of Atonement. So hopefully you'll come back and join us then.